Hi, I'm Donovan, and this is Sex and Sacrament, Chapter 5. It is the last chapter, and there ended up, it's been a while since I posted an episode or continued the reading. Um, that's because this chapter was never completed, and so it took me a while to put this together, even this little subsection that I have here. Anyway, I'll just start here. So this subsection, this first subsection of chapter 5, first of all, chapter 5 is called Sex and Sacrament, Loving as Nourishing Redemptive Communion. For right now, that's the provisional title. I still haven't finished writing this chapter. This first subsection is called Grace as Awe, Not Shame, Healing Suppressed Wounded Self. So if you're watching this stand alone, what's part of what's being referenced here is that previous chapters, the first half of the book is all about different kinds of prayer, and it's leading into the second half of the book, which is about the body and engaging all the senses in experiencing spiritual wonder, really, and awe. I talk a lot about sacrament because I came out of a Christian tradition. It'll make sense more as I write this. But anyway, so the whole thing is really about grace, experiencing grace initially in the first half in kind of traditional ways through different types of prayer and different world traditions, but primarily the biblical or Abrahamic ones, primarily the biblical ones. And then when I'm saying healing suppressed wounded self in this intro to chapter 5, the last chapter was about experiencing chronic illness, including mental illnesses, including pain, mourning, trauma, and being resurrected with our wounds, knowing each other by our wounds, and our wounds, instead of hiding our wounds being a place where we can experience the sacred, not only in terms of healing, but in terms of healing and being shaped by the pain or the wounds that we have. And again, not denying each other's wounds or shaming each other for having wounds, but recognizing each other by our wounds and sort of the sacredness of that. So if you haven't seen all the backstory, that was the backstory to this. So now I'll get into this. So grace is awe, not shame, healing suppressed wounded self. So when I first wrote this manuscript, I was bedridden by chronic digestive illness, was skeletally thin, and I was growing thinner, on sabbatical from my job as a full professor of systematic theology. Day after day in the bed I shared with my spouse of 6 years, I would read spiritual autobiographies, letters, and prayers from people who kept hope alive while imprisoned by Nazis, inquisitors, or self-quarantined in monastic communities during times of plague and feudal wars. All of that stuff I referenced in all the previous chapters. These mystics from around the world and throughout time, in times, in some cases, times quite similar to our own, and what kind of faith sustained them, and what they got out of that, and how they survived it. And anyway, in that time of my own bedriddenness with chronic illness that I thought I was dying from, was occasionally punctuated by joyful little visits from our youngest child, who was about 5 at the time. Both my spouse and I were closeted at this time, and although we shared a room, we were not even friends. I didn't even know my spouse was closeted at this time. I thought my spouse was a heterosexual man. Although I loved our children and had longed my whole life to raise a family and have a home, I was always angry, barely civil, and often prayed that either I would die of this mysterious illness or that my spouse, a blue-collar laborer whose job was physically dangerous, would meet with a fatal accident to end our mutual misery. Divorcing was unimaginable to me at that time. Despite years of seeking to leave the evangelical university where I was a theology professor, I had been unable to secure any other position, and now I had 2 children to support. being a woman, as I was living at the time, and already once divorced and remarried from a previous, also miserable closeted marriage, made my being what I'm trying to say is this made my situation precarious. Being seen as a woman in evangelical culture, teaching theology, teaching ministry, I was always met with a healthy dose of no, an unhealthy dose of skepticism and misogyny in my professional life. So adding to that, already being a divorcee, which was pretty scandalous in that context, and remarried, which added another layer of scandal, that made my situation precarious enough. And now, at this time, while I was on sabbatical, the university was drifting from the progressive, wide umbrella evangelical inclusiveness of my early years there to a hard, right leaning stance, especially on the issue of same sex marriage, and that I was openly opposing in journal articles and at conferences and with the administration. So I was in a very precarious situation. Another divorce wasn't something I had the luxury to consider, not with the need to support and ensure two children. For me, the university's stance on same sex marriage, against same sex marriage, was heretical, apostate. There is no scriptural or historical warrant for Christians to oppose same sex covenant, nor to meddle in civilly recognized marriages. These what happens in terms of civil law, that's outside the scope of the church, especially in the United States when there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. And I was a professor of theology and an ordained minister who performed marriages. So, to address this conflict with the tools of Christian sacred texts and historical tradition was, in fact, my job. To prevent me from doing so was not only a violation of the academic freedom that an accredited university accepting federal scholarship and grant aid must uphold, but even more significantly, impossible given my job description, teaching theology and church history. I even reached out to a federal agency, an employment branch of the government, and to a legal nonprofit, a well known law nonprofit that protects civil rights, during this sabbatical for help to mediate this conflict from a perspective of religious freedom. The core of my conflict with my employer was about different interpretations of our religious texts and traditions, and my religious freedom was just as much at stake as theirs. Both agencies, the federal one and the nonprofit, declined to take the case after talking about it with me and giving it consideration. But these agonizing conflicts about marriage were, doctors then thought, at the root of my own chronic pain and weakness from which I was expected to die, which drove me to bedridden months of devotional reading and prayer that gave rise to this book, and now getting to this chapter, an inescapable conviction that marriage, in fact, is a sacrament. How much I did not want to believe this, how angry this made me that it kept coming to me in prayer that marriage was a sacrament, how I could not stomach even the writing of these words, marriage is a sacrament. This chapter, how much I couldn't even stomach completing this chapter, is beyond expression. In the Alice through the looking glass madness of Protestant evangelicalism, to call marriage sacramental was a heresy. It was too Roman Catholic. Yet, to protect the sanctity of marriage, the church was willing to excommunicate clergy, divide families, and cut itself in half, as if marriage was, in fact, sacramental to it. So, people who have lost the sense of what is sacred, people who have cut themselves off from the testimony of their own God given senses and feelings to the ways that invisible grace meets us where we are in prayer, in silence, in beauty, in tears, in laughter, even in illness and pain. All these previous chapters that have been leading up to this one cannot, of course, suddenly switch gears. That's why I spent all the time I spent all those many years teaching the things that are in those earlier chapters, because I thought we have to heal. They have to know that they're allowed to pray. They have to know that they're allowed to experience God through their senses before we can even start to talk about intimacy. How can you have a deep sense of the embodied presence of the sacred in an enduring covenant relationship between two people when you don't have a deep sense of the embodied presence of the sacred anywhere? How can you experience the sacredness of being overwhelmed by awe and tenderness and intimacy when you fear the body and its emotions and variability, its changing moods and its susceptibility to illnesses, and most of all, its differences and variations? And that subsection with those rhetorical questions, obviously, everything that came before this chapter is my response, constructive response, bridge building response, hopeful response to reach out an olive branch to folks that I believe are struggling with those things, and that's why we can't even have these conversations until they can embrace that God would meet them in their own bodies prayerfully. I don't mean to use us them language. We any of us, if we can meet God where we are, if we can believe that God or the divine or whatever we call it wants to meet us where we're at and is loving, if we can work through all that other stuff, then we can start to get to this conversation. All right, my next subsection is building on that. That was my context for writing this chapter. I wanted to explain why this next subsection is still here, because originally this chapter was written in the closet. So this next subsection is called Bread or Stone, a closeted reflection on marriage. So this initially was half of the original chapter 5. But when I went back and reread it, I was like, I cannot say this anymore. This doesn't. It's still me. I want to share it anyway because it was born out of what I just shared with you. All that prayer, all that reflection, all that emotional intensity, all that conflict, all that wanting to be part of a community of faith. These people that I loved and that I had worked with and been friends with and raised my children around and gotten married because that's what they did and that's what and I wanted to fit in and I wanted to be the person they wanted me to be and I wanted to be the person they thought God wanted me to be. I truly did. So I wrote this from a very well-meaning place, but I wanted to share with you the context of how troubling it was to me, and that as a person of faith, my conflicts with them were coming from our shared faith. They weren't me being angry at them or me not having faith or yeah, I believed at core that we had some of the same beliefs and that we were devoted to the same divine, all being, all loving presence and wanted to live in harmony with that. But I couldn't understand what they were doing, and thought it was my job as a theologian and pastor to help them get back on the path to grace. So anyway, so I wanted you to understand that as a context for this. So this is really the beginning of the chapter, Bread or Stone, a closeted reflection on marriage. I added this part now that it's closeted. When I wrote it, I didn't say I was in the closet because I was trying to be that person. Looking back on it now, this only makes sense from a closeted person. But I'm also going to close it by pointing in the direction I'm going to go next, so we'll open it up after this. Hebrew and Christian scriptures are full of examples of troubled heterosexual marriages. Obviously, I've revised this, by the way. Okay, this isn't in the original language of closetedness. I'm out of the closet now, right? So anyway, let me start over again. Hebrew and Christian scriptures are full of examples of troubled heterosexual marriages. For Christians, most notably the parents of Jesus, Joseph and Mary, an older man and a teenage girl pregnant with a child not his. Yet in some way, living in such a marriage and staying married can be a form of prayer, living prayerfully. So, what I was trying to say, these biblical examples, I believed then and still kind of believe, show us that a marriage doesn't have to be perfect and happy and stereotypically American sitcom type marriage. to be a faithful marriage, to be a marriage where we can experience prayer and spiritual growth. That's what I'm trying to get at. So that's why I invoked the Bible there for a second. Both times I married in the church. I was seeking a life of ministry and service. By the time I married the second time, I was ordained. I closeted myself in both marriages in hopes that doing what God and the church I served seemed to want would take if I just worked hard enough at prayer and self-denial. Each time, my spouse and I were able to remain faithful and stay married for 8 years. Each marriage lasted 8 years. Many more people have much more experience at marriage than I do. I have no expertise at marriage, so that's not why I'm sharing this. I can only testify that as miserable as I was, often suicidal, prayer sustained me even in these marriages, in spite of my own failings and the palpable disappointment, even disgust, I felt coming at me from my spouse. So I guess what I'm trying to say is these were tough marriages for me to live in. Yeah, I didn't succeed at it. I did it for 8 years every day faithfully for 8 years each time. That's nothing to jump up and down about, but my point is those were hard days for me. That's what I was trying to get to, for me to survive, stay faithful, not off myself, last as long as I did, even though it wasn't that long. Took a lot of prayer, and that's what I'm sharing about. In the moments when I could understand marriage as a sacrament, I could at least live out my marriage as a prayer of blessing, a gift of God to God, rather than focusing on my personal pleasure or disappointment. In other words, when the marriage wasn't about me, it could be a lot more fulfilling. When I did experience it as a means of grace and not an end in itself, I was able to be in it and be of service in it. And I think that's why I kept this little subsection in there. I'm certainly not promoting being in the closet now or making yourself miserable. I'm only saying I wanted to remember these lessons, because if I was able to experience that even in an unhappy marriage, then I can believe that people who have happier marriages might also be able to experience marriage as a means of grace. And that there's things here I want to remember, and that have helped me outside, even in friendships or in working relationships or with my children. So releasing those expectations of personal gratification paradoxically freed me, at least sometimes, to receive what God can give through marriage. Love is always a gift, regardless of whom we love. And here I really look to 1 John 4, particularly verses 7 and 8, to remember that love comes from God. It's not something that I do by myself. It's not from me. It's not from somebody else to me. We can be channels for love in each other's lives, but in this tradition, at least in this way of talking about God, I'm understanding that there's a greater source of love that we each experience. Love itself can never be wrong from this perspective, that love is God and God is love, so that love itself can't be wrong. And again, I'm looking at 1 John 4:8 there. In an unhappy marriage, remembering that love came from outside of me, that love itself couldn't be wrong. In an unhappy marriage, that reminded me that the person I was married to was not to blame for my misery. Neither my spouse nor I was wrong, as in the wrong person. Being angry at each other, blaming each other, feeling held hostage by each other was not going to help. Blaming, you're just the wrong person. That's why I'm miserable. In moments where instead I could experience loving as God loves, not selfishly, like, oh, how dissatisfied I am, or what should I be getting out of this. When I could experience loving as God loves, that love, that kind of love, that unconditional love, that I can just be here and channel, let that love flow through me. Not a romantic or even a companionate love, but a channel through which God's love could flow, was able to bear fruit through each of us and through our family life for others. I guess what I'm trying to say, that was a very wordy way to say it, but what I found, what I experienced in marriage is that when we would step out of the way, when we step out of each other's way in our own way, we could be a channel for love. Love could come through us, even if we weren't feeling it, or if we weren't, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but we could be with the love and the love could come through us. And it was more, for me, it was much more a matter of being willing to be in acceptance of the way things were instead of focusing on how I wished they could be, or blaming and being angry and disappointed. Just in moments when God's unconditional, non-romantic love flowed through the channel of shared life with that one person and those in close proximity to us, especially our children, love to others could also flow more freely. So again, it was about, instead of me blocking the channel of God's love with my own expectations or my own self-focus about what would I need or what how I wish things could be or something like that, if I could step out of the way of that and clear that out, that love could flow through us to our and it was a more pleasant home life. So even when unhappy, marriage and family life taught me to focus on loving with God's love, not my own, and loving those closest to me right now, rather than only an impersonal service to humanity that is a lot safer because there's no rejection in it, and I could just go feed hungry people, or work with people who are homeless, or work with people who are in addiction, or work with people who are feeling suicidal. These are all things that I still do a lot. Being of service is one way to be loving, and it's different than that one-on-one where people are seeing me up close with my warts over time. Well, I was figuratively speaking, with my character flaws over time, and I have to risk rejection and I have to work through conflict, and it's a different kind of challenge, right? To be in an enduring relationship with someone over time. Married and family love is a gift of God. It's too challenging and too precarious to be achieved through happy accident or human effort alone, in my view. In the closeted prayer I rediscovered in these notes for this chapter, in this section, I asked God frequently and I remember praying this, I asked God frequently to love unselfishly at least one person. And again, I can't stress this enough. This was a time when I was physically dying. I was miserable. I hated life. I hated the people I lived with, not because of any flaws of theirs, but I just felt trapped, miserable. And I often would think of the image of an animal caught in a steel trap, like a hunter's trap, that would gnaw its own foot off rather than, stay caught in the trap. That's how I felt. I was in so much pain in that situation. I just was angry and wanting to die all the time. A very unpleasant person to live with, to say, actually, it was worse than that. And it was really hard for those who had to live with me. So what I used to pray to get relief from that is, God, could you just help me love one person today? And I didn't even try to, maybe it could be my spouse, but anybody. So I would pray that. I would say, let me love unselfishly at least one person today. And I would pray to redirect my feelings to a godly kind of love, not the kind of love that I thought I was longing for. I had a lot of sexual fantasies. I would zone out and daydream because I was so in pain in my own real life. So I would ask God to redirect me toward this godly kind of love. Let me be a channel of your love instead of focusing on this selfish fantasy kind of love. And in my prayer, I would realize too, as I was praying that, I would realize this isn't actually loving towards myself, my spouse, or anyone else when I'm focused on what I want out of love. And it's not loving toward God either. So I really was praying for relief. Just redirect me from myself to loving someone else. Love is not primarily or exclusively sexual. It's not self-seeking. Now, I want to be really clear. This is going to be a sex-positive chapter, but I'm talking about how I prayed in the closet. So in the closet as I was trying to suppress myself and live in this joyless, loveless marriage. And I did that not only once, but twice in my life, to go into a sexless, loveless marriage. As I did that, paradoxically, the more I tried to push it away from myself, the more obsessed I, kind of like Augustine, whom I've talked about in other chapters, I could hardly stop thinking about sex. So this was it in my prayer life at the time. It was a big deal for me to say, okay, that isn't everything. I got to remember that there's other aspects to love, even though there's this one kind of love I'm really longing for, and I can hardly stop thinking about it. I really do want to be redirected to other ways of loving. So paradoxically, once I stopped pushing it away, I'm not obsessed with it anymore. It's come to balance. I'm much more sex positive in what I have to share, but it's not all consuming. I hope that I know I'm kind of digressing right now, but I want to be really clear that it's not about being in one extreme or another. It's having a really well balanced and whole, complete, harmonious experience is what I'm trying to share here in this book. Anyway, so the point of me saying that love is not exclusively sexual, because I was struggling with those kind of impulses. But my main point was to realize it's not self-seeking. When I was focused on my own pleasure, I was focused on myself. There's nothing wrong with pleasure, definitely, especially sharing it in an intimate, loving way with someone, but I wasn't sharing it in an intimate, loving way with someone. I was focused on myself. So that was the part I really needed relief from. I tried to surrender to God my romantic feelings and sexual desires for someone other than my spouse in these prayers. And I realized that objectifying, when I was longing for this other person or a certain type of experience with this other person, I was objectifying that person as the focus of my own feelings and desires. I wasn't really loving them for them. I wasn't getting close to them. I wasn't communicating this to them in any way. I wasn't having any interaction with this person in real life. So it was not loving. It was just about me focusing again on my own feelings and desires. So it was a dead end. Love as a means of grace, on the other hand, is an equal exchange between two complete human beings, not a subject and an object, but two subjects. No one is an object. Love is always between two subjects. As much as I feared exploring this area of sex and marriage in my prayer life, I kept being surprised as I prayed this way, to feel no anger, shame, or guilt coming back at me from the one to whom I was sharing my heart, but only instead I felt affirmed, uplifted, and encouraged, and gently and tenderly redirected and refocused, just as I asked in those prayers over and over again, as if he was gently asking me himself. The words of Jesus kept coming to my mind in those times. Which of you, if your child asks for bread, will give them a stone? Or if they ask for a fish, would give them a snake. Excuse me. If you know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will God give good gifts to those who ask God? So at one point, as I was praying that, it's probably come through. If you have seen the other chapters or episodes or guided practices that I've shared here, I tend to pray with images more than words. So one time I was contemplating those passages. I went to the scriptures and read them, and I was really struggling and thinking, am I just being really self-indulgent here to be thinking about this whole fish and bread and stones and scorpions? Am I just deluding myself, thinking that this applies in this situation? And then I I don't know if I imagined it or if it was an image that involuntarily came into my mind, but I do remember very vividly having this image of being given a stone like as if Jesus handed me a stone and said, okay, well, here, eat it then. If you're not sure, and just the feeling of biting down on a stone and cracking the teeth, and you can't do that. You can't eat a stone. Would God give? No, God's not going to give me a stone. So I was sharing this with someone, a very prominent evangelical who was willing to pray with me about this back in this time, and he was very moved. How did I say prominent? It's not important that he was prominent. It's just that he was a person that was, how can I say this? He was a mentor to me in some ways, and he was a very humble mentor. So when we were praying about this, that image was very powerful. It was so powerful to him. He teared up. He got very quiet. He kept talking about it to me over many months, about this idea of biting down on a stone, and how vivid that was to him, and how it communicated very powerfully to him. So I haven't really written this down in the book. He wanted me to write that down, but I never have written that down. But I just thought tonight I'll share it before I go into this thing. So there's a guided practice that goes with this, and the reason I told you about that visual prayer that I had was it was the visual prayer and talking about it with this mentor of mine that affirmed to me that this image might be powerful to other people in prayer too. So I did create a very small little liturgical combination of Lectio Divina and prayer. It's just a little liturgy. I don't know what else to call it. And I did this with students, and it was also very powerful for them. So I'm going to share with you in a separate video. I'm going to do a guided practice video if you're interested, and I'll share that little liturgy with you. It's very short, but it's just giving you a heads up. It's just reading aloud that passage from the Gospel of Matthew and from the Gospel of Luke, and just inviting some quiet prayer. So again, I did put that together in the closet. It's still meaningful to me now, though. I'm still tempted to settle for less than God probably wants. God wants to nourish us, right? God wants us to have bread and fish and not be eating stones and scorpions. But I do still have a tendency to grab for the scorpions and the stones. So so I think you don't have to necessarily be in a closet to necessarily have struggles with shame and self-denial sometimes. So maybe this will be useful to someone else besides me. But I do promise that as the chapter continues, it gets more positive and affirming, and I get to the point. So okay, good night for tonight.